I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
We're back again after a 2-week break for part 3 of our accidental series on Zhuangzi. I guess we should kind of reintroduce him since it's been a little while. He is, I think, the most amazing philosopher in Chinese history. He wrote a book. It's called The Zhuangzi. Actually, I should take that back. He may or may not have written the book. We're not actually sure if he existed as a real person. I suspect he was a real person, but that the first 7 or so chapters of his book were actually written by him, Zhuangzi, the person. His first name was Zhou. His last name was Zhuang. He was not your average Joe.
It's a great pun. Wow, just a great pun.
I've been preparing that for 20 years. He is, I think, the most unique thinker in Chinese history.
Agreed.
Does that seem fair?
It seems fair. I agree with that completely.
Okay. He has some incredible passages. We're going to look at another one today. This one is about a butcher whose name is Ting. The translation we're looking at today actually does not translate him as Butcher Ting. It just refers to him as the butcher, but I believe his name in the original is Ting.
I'll just throw out there real quick so people remember, because we're doing a bi-weekly thing. It might pay to remind people. But the last passage we looked at was setting up the Tao as a source of power, a source of ability, a source of being able to do amazing things. And you and I, Lee, kind of hedged, and we're like, what does this mean? Well, it kind of means this, but also not, which is pretty much the only way to discuss it. But I mentioned that future podcasts would be about passages where it seems like Zhuangzi goes, okay, all right, do you want to see what this looks like? Here's what it looks like. And so the passage today is that he takes the example of a butcher, probably maybe the last person you could imagine wielding enormous power through the Tao, and yet that's what he's doing. And it's a really interesting passage. Do you want to read part of it, Lee? You want me to read it? How should we do this?
You read it.
Okay. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's actually quite a bit longer.
Rob, I would say just start from the wonderful or something like that, because you don't want to read the whole beginning.
No. So just to set it up, a nobleman, Lord Wenhui, is in a market, sees a butcher doing some absolutely incredible stuff, and he says, wonderful, that skill can attain such heights. And then this is what follows. The cook put down his cleaver and responded, what your servant loves is the way, which goes beyond mere skill. When I first began to cut oxen, what I saw was nothing but whole oxen. After 3 years, I no longer saw whole oxen. Today, I meet the ox with my spirit, rather than looking at it with my eyes. My sense organs stop functioning, and my spirit moves as it pleases. In accord with the natural grain, I slice at the great crevices, lead the blade through the great cavities. Following its inherent structure, I never encounter the slightest obstacle, even where the veins and arteries come together, or where the ligaments and tendons join, much less from obvious big bones. A good cook changes his cleaver once a year because he chops. An ordinary cook changes his cleaver once a month because he hacks. Now, I've been using my cleaver for 19 years and have cut up thousands of oxen with it, but the blade is still as fresh as though it had just come from the grindstone. Between the joints, there are spaces, but the edge of the blade has no thickness. Since I am inserting something without any thickness into an empty space, there will certainly be lots of room for the blade to play around in. That's why the blade is still as fresh as though it had just come from the grindstone. Nonetheless, whenever I come to a complicated spot and see that it will be difficult to handle, I cautiously restrain myself, focus my vision, and slow my motion. With an imperceptible movement of the cleaver, plop, and the flesh is already separated, like a clump of earth collapsing to the ground. I stand there holding the cleaver in my hand, look all around me with complacent satisfaction. Then I wipe off the cleaver and store it away. Wonderful, said Lord Wenhui. From hearing the words of the cook, I have learned how to nourish life.
That's a great reading, Rom. So first off, we've got to talk about class, right? This is not Confucius. This is not Mencius. Those guys, they would be like talking to the king, the big head honcho. They would not be talking to some schmuck in a market who's doing the dirtiest job in the world, that is cleaning meat. And
right, I agree. And I can't help it. I don't know if you read it this way too, but Zhuangzi always has this sort of puckish quality to him where it sometimes feels like he's messing with people just to see what they'll do, right? Like, how are they going to respond if I tell the story this way? So you can see him, maybe by this point, some people in Zhuangzi's time are going, wow, this guy's got some great stuff. Let's go listen to him. And he goes, oh, really? You're going to listen to me? How about this? Go learn from the butcher. And everyone goes, no, that's no way, right? He comes up with this amazing parable, kind of a parable, actually, now that I think about it.
It is a parable, yeah.
It is totally a parable, yeah. But it's about a gross, dirty job. And the closest analog I can think of in my head is, have you ever read Baudelaire, the French poet?
Yeah.
Okay, he's got this poem about a dead, bloated horse corpse on the side of the road. And he's comparing that to love. And it's an incredible poem. I mean, the language is stunning, but it's not supposed to work. You don't write love poems about dead, bloated horses. You just don't, right? And in the same way, you don't write world-shattering philosophy about dudes doing gross jobs in markets. But Zhuangzi does.
Zhuangzi did it. Yeah. This is a great point. So there is this issue of class that we need to pay attention to when reading this passage. I think also, Rob, last episode we were struggling with the definition of the Tao. What is it? Is it anything? Is it everything? And if it is everything, then doesn't defining the Tao as everything mean that it actually means nothing? I think that here we get a better understanding of what the Tao actually is. The Tao is not a concrete thing, but it is the emptiness through which you most easily move. It's the path of least resistance. That's what Butcher Ting here is coming through. He's cutting through the spaces that don't have anything or that have such little amount of friction that he can cut for years without actually dulling his blade.
And if you needed a sort of one-sentence guide to, okay, well, how am I supposed to go about learning and doing this stuff? I would say this would be pretty close. The butcher says, whenever I come to a complicated spot and see that it will be difficult to handle, I cautiously restrain myself, focus my vision, and slow my motion. I think that's a really neat way to encapsulate a lot of what Zhuangzi talks about with the Tao. Like, whatever you think it may be, you need to stop, you need to focus, and you need to very carefully proceed, right? Molecule by molecule, if you possibly can, to see where those spaces are. Where does my life intersect the easiest with the things around me? How can I make this frictionless? And that's not a practical guide, but I think it's a lot more helpful than just saying, like, you can be super powerful.
It's everything, right? Like
it's everything. Go for it.
The passage that we read for the last episode was great, but it also wasn't. It was hard to apply it. But here,
right.
I feel much more like this is a great application. And Rob, you used the word parable. I think that's the perfect word. It allows us in this very simple imagery to see what Zhuangzi is talking about when he explains the Tao. The Tao is sort of, I don't know if it would be fair to call it the anti-friction. Would it be fair to call it the path of least resistance, right?
Yeah.
I still struggle to define it, and I think Zhuangzi would be okay because Zhuangzi doesn't ever explicitly define anything, so he's okay with me struggling to define the Tao. The Tao is more of an absence rather than a presence, but that's perfectly acceptable in Zhuangzian philosophy. It's more of a negative philosophy than a positive philosophy in some ways.
Yeah, I agree. And let's bring this in too. The butcher has a very specific set of requirements. The butcher is not saying, I now am in tune with all the forces in the universe. I can fly on clouds. The butcher is seeking a way to perfectly understand his craft. Perfectly, right? And I find that a really interesting application because a lot of philosophy in the Chinese tradition does tend to at least appear to describe all of reality, right? Here is how all of human society is structured, right? Here, though, you have one guy doing one thing in a perfect way, and that's held up to be, look, this is what it means, right? This is what the kind of thing you should be learning from. It's not to become an immortal. It's, if you're a farmer, what's the path of least resistance as a farmer? How can you get out of the way of the land so it produces and you don't even really have to work that hard?
He talks about how at the beginning he saw the whole oxen, but eventually he had to learn to not see the whole oxen. And then he talks about meeting it in spirit. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it does seem like he's kind of going from seeing the world as it appears falsely to the eyes and then kind of intuiting the world. There's a certain strain of Buddhism here, Rob. Of course, Buddhism does not exist at the time Zhuangzi is writing, and it will be another almost 1,000 years before Buddhism has a real influence in China. But I think that you can see some of the strains that Buddhism, as it enters China, is going to pick up. So when Buddhism comes to China, eventually a lot of Chinese folks are going to take it and indigenize it. And that involves kind of incorporation of lots of Zhuangzian thought. And so if you've studied Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism, you can see a lot of elements of Zhuangzi coming here into Buddhism, right?
Absolutely. It's funny because, we talk about Zhuangzi, a lot of times we talk about humor, we talk about philosophical perspective, but this is just a really well-written parable. It's nice to read. It's pleasant. It makes sense. It makes you think a little bit. And this is something that we haven't really talked about much with Zhuangzi, but there's such unbelievable range in Zhuangzi. We're going to talk about something totally different from this passage in the next podcast, but I'd be hard pressed to think of a writer in any tradition who's able to put out seemingly everything like this. You have little one sentence aphorisms, you have nice little parables, you have mythology, you have Platonic dialogues. He just kind of pulls everything into play.
Certainly, I think it would be hard to find a writer who is as good at pulling all this stuff together and speaking to all these different topics, and who is writing in the 5th century BCE. This is the high point. We should point this out. Zhuangzi's writing around the time, not exactly the same time, but around the time that the Greek philosophers are writing. And I would put dollars to donuts on Zhuangzi compared with Greek philosophers any day of the week. Rob, does that seem fair? You're actually much more knowledgeable about Greek philosophy than I am.
Well, it's totally different. I mean, if you said, which are you going to read on a desert island? Well, Zhuangzi. I mean, that's a no-brainer. I mean, I can't think of a situation where I would... Well, because, and we talked about this in an older podcast, there's an element of fun to Zhuangzi. There's an element of Zhuangzi where he goes... It's like he sees the complexity of his own philosophy and understands that at some level you also sort of just have to laugh because... No, you're not ever going to figure it out. There's a kind of humility about Zhuangzi where if you really are saying things like this, you just kind of have to relax a little bit occasionally. And there's nothing in Plato or Aristotle that is remotely fun.
So I agree with you. There's nothing in Aristotle that's remotely fun, and there's nothing in the Plato, and that is the stuff that was written by Plato that's more Platonic, that's fun. I do see elements of Socrates, though, and of course Socrates is not himself a writer. Everything we know about Socrates, pretty much, not entirely 100%, but 95% of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. And the Socrates that we have in Plato's early writings are probably something like the real Socrates, and that Socrates is actually pretty interesting. I think if there is a philosopher in the Western tradition that could go toe-to-toe with Zhuangzi, it would be the original Socrates, not the Platonic Socrates, but the original Socrates. I think Zhuangzi would win. sorry, let me rephrase that. I know Zhuangzi would win, but if you're someone who likes Socrates but thinks Socrates doesn't go far enough, you're going to like Zhuangzi.
And my last word on this is I can't say enough for a philosophy that has as one of its core beliefs, before you move, before you do anything, restrain yourself, focus, and slow down. That almost sounds like self-help stuff, but one of the things that is beautiful in Zhuangzi's philosophy is this belief that, look, you can cause a heck of a lot of damage by acting quickly because you believe you understand things. We've wreaked enormous havoc on nature by thinking, well, we'll just do this because that kind of works, and then realize 100 years down the line that by doing that, we're disrupting entire ecosystems, even though...
Let's introduce frogs to Australia to take care of this one problem, and actually ends up causing a much bigger problem.
This one crop yields a lot of money and we can grow it pretty fast. Let's just grow that and not rotate crops anymore. Oh, now we have the Dust Bowl, right? It's just based on not understanding the interplay of things, not understanding that this might seem great, but slow down and focus and really pay attention to what is happening, not just on the thing you're looking at, but between all the things around it, right? Because Butcher Ting is not just going, hey, how can I get this muscle off the bone? He's looking at every single aspect of this thing that he's carving up, so that he's not just carving it up, separating it. It's like the body itself wants to be separated, and he's just finding the easiest way to help it do that.
Be deliberate. That's one of the greatest takeaways I have in terms of my personal education coming out of grad school. I had a teacher who he taught me how to teach, and his first thing was, okay, teaching is like any other activity. If you want to do it well, you have to be deliberate and think through why you're doing what you're doing. Before that, I had done what a lot of teachers do, or at least a lot of the teachers that I know do, which is just kind of higgledy-piggledy present stuff that I knew, facts, throw those at students. But when I was deliberate in my thinking about teaching, I was actually much more effective. And I think that's what Zhuangzi is getting at here. Just, find the path of least resistance. When you see something that seems hard, stop, think, and be deliberate.
I would agree.
I think that's a great place to end it, Rob.
I agree.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.